Prime Minister.
Okay, hold on. Let me prep first. Set my timer. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, as in the info slide, filial piety has been defined as a fundamental concept in Confucian philosophy, and it's focusing on the moral and ethical framework of many East Asian cultures, which includes Chinese, Korean, and Japanese societies. So this filial piety refers to the virtue of respect, obedience, and care that a child is expected to show to the parents, elders, and ancestors. So meaning that from our understanding is that there's a child relationship to the parents and respecting the ancestor uh, in terms of giving respect as in the ritual side and also uh, and also um, operating in the daily life as operating in during the daily life. So as in this house supports for the decline of the filial piety, the characterization is that filial piety focusing on the self-care to the parents and to the higher hierarchy in the family, um, which also which also sometimes when the person don't have the much resources and not much time to give, but they focusing on giving the self-care towards the family itself, which is meaning that the parents and also providing resources into initiate the activities that conducts the filial piety. So in terms of obedience, the parents and also if the grandparents also still that have a say in the child, usually the person that receive more like the receiving and conducting the filial piety, which also will listen to their parents and without having a say. For example, maybe the child wants to pursue arts, but the family find it better for the person to initiate and creating career in the finance world. So our side sees that the our side sees that the person don't have much in say and feel like it doesn't really able to be listened by this filial piety initiate filial piety situations. So in this world where the filial piety is declining, so it does distinguish in between the role as to listen and care and or be obedience towards the higher up of the family hierarchy, but it also giving the shape of the giving effect in the roles of the person as a character, because self-care should be as in self-love, and this affect the physical well-being of the persons. So this is why we support the declining of the filial piety to nurture their own health and happiness. So for the personal growth themselves. So it's also giving the practice of self-care to the persons, and but also not to the points of neglecting the responsibility. So in terms of obedience, there is much in social order that we have to follow. So acting as a lower person, they do have to abide higher ups, right? But the obedience part is that the capacity for the person to abide sometimes need to be respected by the higher ups, by the parents, that it is important for them to recognize the person capability and to choose what they actually want. So in conclusion, it's not a opposition, but more like dynamic structure with the declining filial piety. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Again, I encourage people to provide their POI preferences before they start their speech. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Alright. Hi everyone, this is Yesh. No preferred gender pronouns. POIs through chat, please. I can see chat. But I will ask for one later. When I do, please raise it then. Again, POIs through chat. Please do not badger me. I'll ask for one later for better engagement all throughout the round. Alright. Starting this speech, in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, there are 2 questions we ought to answer in this debate. 1, why is the decline of filial piety unstrategic and regrettable? And secondly, how are we going to propel society better in these East Asian cultures with filial piety, thus preventing from the past
Hello.
harms?
Hello. Hello.
So student exchange responses. What is the problem with OU
sorry.
of debate properly? I don't think framing.
Hello, can we pause? Okay.
Hello.
Sorry. The first 30 seconds of your speech is robotic. So I think there's a audio issue or an internet issue.
I'll just try to speak on my partner's device if that's fine. Hold up.
Yeah. that would be great. And please restart your speech.
Hello, is this better?
Yes. Sorry. Can you please say a sentence or like read out the motion?
Hold up. Okay. Okay. This cell supports the decline of filial piety.
Okay. Yeah. Your audio's a bit better here. Thank you.
Hold up. Okay. Restart. I'll just restart the speech. Starting the
Yep.
speech in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, there are two questions we ought to answer in this debate. One, why is the decline of filial piety unstrategic and regrettable? But secondly, how are we going to propel society better in East Asian cultures with filial piety, thus circumventing from the past harms? But before characterizations, just two experienced responses. What is the problem with OG right off the bat? Firstly, they were unable to frame this debate properly. I don't think framing just looks like reading the info slide. Note how filial piety is going to be clear on my frame later. But secondly, it's unclear as to why self-love that is crucial for the growth and happiness of the person only exists under their bench because they were unable to accrue this, because they were unable to mechanize as to how this is necessarily exclusive under their bench. Even if they argue that children don't often get a say, thus these harms, we argue that it doesn't justify as to why we want the decline of familial piety when the harms has led to big changes in the culture of these countries. But even if you don't buy this response, this is going to be clear under our counterfactual. Leading to characterization then. The stance is clear that in opening opposition, we support the existence of filial piety, but not the old version of it. This is to say that we ought to have a social normativity reset then on this. This leads me to my mechanism and frame. What then is filial piety actually looks like? Firstly, unlike OG, we frame filial piety not just the hierarchies in the families, but rather the virtues inculcated upon children. So note that if the goal of these parents is to raise children that would want to give back in the long run, I think that this is best achievable under our bench. But even if this is not the case, or even if they say that this is bad, we argue then that this is going to be better under our counterfactual. But we beg to ask the question: why was there a decline in the first place? Four things under this. Firstly, because of how rampant the liberal ideologies has become. Note how whitewashed almost every culture is now, and due to the widespread of influence of the Western culture in social media. This looks like the portrayal of a Korean family that migrated in Canada in the Netflix series Kim's Convenience, or the Chinese family that migrated in the US in the off the boat, right? These kinds of media influences how culture is shaped not just for immigrant families, but also for the Asian families that are being fed by those like kinds of influences, right? Because probably they're going to think, but they're Chinese. But so this means that they can suck at math, and probably I can too. Or Janet is Korean and she talks and shouts back to her amma and appa, so maybe I can too. Or even on the parents' perspective, that they will think that even if that's the way that their children in that series or in other white families are raised, they still succeed anyway. Because secondly, because the mindset that most millennial parents employ is that they want to break the generational trauma that they have experienced due to filial piety. This leads me to the mechanism then. This is where the stance comes into play. Because the counterfactual from OO is that we want children to continue on learning to be respectful and giving back to their elders or parents, but at the same time, not the same levels of extent in which it played in the past. Because we agree with government that this has created trauma that they might probably want to end by now. But then again, we question as to how you're going to keep the culture that has been ingrained in these countries if this is the case. More on this later. But lastly, the mechanism then is clear that we're going to campaign for the reintegration and re-strengthening of how filial piety is done, but at the same time teach parents how it should be taught properly, not through corporal punishment, but rather through other forms of parenting. And note that this is not necessarily hard, because we can just say that there's an existence of soft parenting, for example, that already exists in status quo. But at the same time, this is not like something that they are diametrically opposed to how their culture actually plays. Because note that soft parenting, comparative to the decline of filial piety, actually not just because the decline of filial piety just removes the virtues that are inculcated upon these children from the get-go. Before I go into argumentations, I'll take a POI from closing. 3, too.
If you say that the core of filial piety within Asian cultures is like something that is so core, you can't necessarily say that the filial piety on your side is something that is soft. Please like engage in all forms of filial piety.
Note that it is not a soft stance for us to say that we're going to change on how filial piety is playing in status quo or in the past, right? It's not a soft stance if we want to break generational trauma. So if we want to have an argumentation or a world in these East Asian cultures that do not necessarily have an opportunity cost, then I think that this is going to be better under opening opposition. This leads me to the argumentations then. Two things, principle and pragmatic. Firstly, on the principle of cultural identity, note how these kinds of culture or these kinds of these kinds of filial piety is actually the way in which these countries have, these are the culture that these kinds of countries actually have. Note how in the event in which the decline keeps on going and going on in the future, this means that you're probably going to have an Asian country that is so whitewashed that probably these kinds of children don't really know or don't really have the virtues that were inculcated in their culture in the first place. This leads us to the idea that they're probably not going to embody the cultural identity that they have. We understand, coming from opening opposition, that probably this is not the only culture that these countries actually have. But note that we argue that the very core of every culture or the very core of every community is their family. So note that in the event in which, or in the advent in which, we are unable to inculcate these kinds of culture or these kinds of principles onto our children, then therefore they're probably never going to learn this in the future. Because if you're going to subject them to other cultures or like probably going to make them study abroad, then probably they're going to be so whitewashed also. But the case then coming from opposition is that this is less likely because you started them at a young age, that they already have the virtues of like being obedient and being respectful to their elders. So even in the advents in which you allow them to go abroad, then they're probably going to still keep those cultures. But then again, we argue that the counterfactual is that we're not going to do the same levels or how corporal punishment was playing during the past, right? So this leads me to the negative material then. Why was the decline bad? Not only is this going to be so whitewashing or so westernized, for example, we argue that decline is bad because it means that there are less children that are incentivized to respect their elders, or less children that are incentivized to be obedient to their elders. This looks like having more children that don't really want to obey or don't really want to follow what their parents actually think is best for them. We argue that there's a reason why there are parents in the first place. Because note that these people already have experiences that have probably shaped them into the kind of person that they are, and they want to shape their children the same way or probably the better way in the future. This means that in the event in which we actually have less children that want to hear their parents out, we're less likely to have children that actually want to obey their parents. This means that in the bigger perspective or in the global perspective, we have less children that want to give back to their families. We have less children that are kinder to their parents or actually just have filial piety. And like at the end of the day, with all that said and done, proud to oppose.
All right, great. Thank you for that speech. Now calling on the DPM. Here.
Hi, first let me set up my timer. Just give me 1 minute. My pronouns are she, her. I prefer my POIs. Just unmute and ask when I ask for them. And I'll ask for them before I go into my arguments. That's it. Oh wait, no. Did I say my name? Okay. My name is Jasmin. Okay. Okay. 1 minute. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let me give you a few rebuttals as to OO's mechanism for their world. Their mechanism was soft, instead of through corporal punishment, it's soft parenting. Let me tell you why this mechanism is flawed and it's unlikely to even be effective. In number one, filial piety is most like 3 levels of analysis to this. Is like, number one is that filial piety is, as in the influence side, most prevalent in East Asian countries, and East Asian societies, where there is a notable emphasis on like discipline, academic achievement, and a respect for authority, which often results in the perception of a stricter parenting style just in general. So I don't understand what they mean by soft parenting when it's not even prevalent in these societies. Like that's number one. And number two, it's crucial to recognize that the parenting approaches of East Asian countries are just evolving, and they're just diversifying, but they're not diversifying to the point of like, oh, we're able to say that more children will be more will be more inclined to be like to use filial piety in the future, because a majority of these parents are still using this strict style of parenting in general. It's not something that's quite evolving at a rapid pace for opposition to say that they're going to be for like opposition to say that it's a viable solution for them to say that oh, we'll use soft parenting. And so that is why I feel like the opposition's case doesn't stand based on the whole metric that their mechanization isn't like achievable within the current status quo. And before that, before I go on into my arguments, any POIs?
Yeah, if you call your mom something really bad, what do you think your mom will respond to you?
I feel like I feel like if you call your mom something in a like something really bad, which wouldn't happen in status quo, because you respect her, you understand that she's given a lot for you and she's given birth to you. I don't understand why it's government's burden to prove this, because why it's the government's burden to prove like, oh, kids will be more disrespectful to their parents, because even in opposition's world, it's not shown how it's not shown how these scenarios won't happen even then. So first I'm going so now that that's done, let me go into my first argument, that is that it's the promotion of individuals' rights and autonomy. And this is because the decline of filial piety encourages it encourages and fosters the individual autonomy and freedom of choice. Now, what does this look like? It looks like individuals can finally put themselves first when they're making decisions in their daily lives. Why is this important? Because it promotes personal growth and the pursuit of one's happiness. Why is the promote of personal growth important? Because it leads to self-fulfilled and self-aware individuals. Or not, we would have spoiled mama's boys running around waiting for the next command to be given out. Instead, in government's world, these individuals can contribute more towards society. When individuals grow personally, they are more likely to contribute positively to their communities because they have a sense of self. They know what their dreams are. They know what they want to do. And why is the pursuit of their own happiness is important? It's because it increases their confidence and it increases their self-fulfillment in life. It allows them to be a happier individual. Now, let's compare the opposition's world and our world based on this argument. In opposition's world, even at their best case, and I'm taking their best case at in their best case, the children don't go through personal growth because they listen to their parents. They listen they aren't allowed to make their own mistakes. So they have low self-esteem, they have low confidence, and they aren't allowed to inevitably learn from the mistakes that they would have made if they had been able to make their own decisions. In government's world, we give these children, we give these people, these individuals, the right to make their own mistakes, and the right to make mistakes, and the choice to make it. Because in current status quo, they are in current status quo with a high level of filial piety, they aren't, because they're just following what their parents are saying, telling them to do. Okay, going on to my second argument is that gender equality is for gender equality and the increase of freedom from traditional gender roles. So based on the info side, filial piety is mostly prevalent in countries with strong gender norms like Japan and Korea. A decline in filial piety can contribute to greater gender equality and the dismantling of these traditional gender roles. Now, what does this look like? Filial piety often places different expectations on sons and daughters within the family. Men are more likely to be expected to provide financially, and women are more likely to be expected to cook, clean, and help around the house. Why is this important? Why is the freedom from these gender roles important? Because it discourages the practice. It discourages this it discourages the practice, and it leads to more equal treatment of children irrespective of their genders, enabling them to pursue their interests and careers without constraints. Now, I myself have been told by my own parents that it's better for me to not dream big and to work somewhere local so that I can look after them when they're older. That's not fair. I have 4 older brothers who can do the same thing, who should be expected to do the same thing. Now, let's go on into comparatives. In the opposition's best case scenario is that it's an increase of filial piety. Thus, these gender roles are maintained. Why? Because more women are expected to stay at home because they keep being told that they should be here so that they can care for their parents in their old age instead of pursuing their own dreams. In our world, these women and men are able to freely pursue their dreams and positively contribute to the economy and have an increase of self-fulfillment. With that, side with OG.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on DLO to close the opening half. You're here.
Hi, am I audible and visible? Am I audible?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, how about this? Am I audible and visible?
Yep, we can see you and hear you.
Wait, sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, you're audible and visible.
Great. Okay. Hi, I'm Lorenz. I will be the deputy leader of the opposition for this debate. Pronouns he, him, but I don't really care. I won't be offended. As for POIs, preferably the 50-minute mark to voice. Again, a 50-minute mark to voice. But I'll probably ask for one. Let me just go through my notes. Okay. Starting my speech in why is it? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, Chair, take note. Until Deputy Prime Minister is still unclear as to why the benefits of growth and happiness is exclusive under their bench, they can't just argue that just because they have more detached parents, that they can be happier. Not sure how that works if no one guides them at all in the future. That's just because you have more autonomy on the comparative, then you can grow better. I don't think that's how it works. At the point in which you're more separated from your parents, that means that you have less guidance, you have less opportunities to look for more information that is able to actually make you be a firmer member of status quo compared to comparative. But secondly, it's also unclear as to why gender roles are a priority to filial piety. Note the lack of mechanism and the connection in this argument and the lack of logical linking and logical walkthrough. They literally didn't say any A to B analysis at all. This means this also cannot be credited, and I think it's the burden then on closing government that they're gonna run that to actually make it make sense. A few floating responses then at the top of my speech before I move on. Right, one. Just because something is not prevalent doesn't mean we can have a counterfactual change in status quo. That's why it's important coming from Yesh, which they failed to respond on. The only thing that they did to our counterfactual was to say, well, you can't do that, and they brushed it aside. That's not how it works, Chair. That's not how debating works. What we told you is that we're comparatively gonna do is we're gonna make the status quo right now, which is very, very problematic, which we do concede to be able to fix those things. But the second thing is just to call them out. Your burden is exactly to prove that even if the harms are going to excess under your bench, you're still supporting the decline that's created these harms in the first place. You can't refuse the burden push on your side and say, oh, it's not our burden to do that. Your burden is exactly to do those things, which you fail to do also. This means you're already sinking at the bottom of this debate. The first push then is just to prove why Yesh was so important in this debate and why opposition or government wasn't able to respond to most of their case. Why was my LO so important? One is a discussion on why this cultural appropriation is likely to bad in the comparative. First, this entails that the large whitewashing in most Asian cultures in the other parts of the world entails a disconnect from who they are between each other, meaning you just change the culture that these people are more used to or who they should be at the comparative. But secondly, the problem with the decline comes to the decline of respect from the elderly. There's already barriers between them, i.e. their age, times, and norms, or just generational differences. With the addition of the decline of filial piety, likely it's just to be much more harmful, meaning there's a higher barrier of entry for communication, which just perpetuates the problem that already exists in status quo. So note, they don't solve anything on their side. But thirdly, you place the expectation on these cultures to change who they are when they're such a main thing in their identity on the comparative. How did government attempt to respond to this? Oh, wait, they didn't respond to this at all, meaning it's then the burden of closing government to respond to this. If they do not, this means this case still stands and that's proves that cultural appropriation on their side is likely to be more and more prevalent and likely to be more harmful. That's why closing government is burdened to do those things. But the second thing we pointed out was the discussion how things are more likely to be harmful on their side as compared to our counterfactual. Take note of what you get coming from government. They say, well, children can get more of what they want now and they're much more happier. But how can they be happier when they have this big disconnect with your parent, when there's a higher barrier of entry of communication, when at the point in which you are 19, you get shooed away from your home and then you have to live on your own? Like you just get more sad, you just get more pressured to look for your own opportunities, to look for some form of semblance of connection within status quo, because the only way that you're going to be able to get that connection in status quo at the point in which you go older is through your families. But now that since there's a disconnect, there's likely to be also a disconnect between your families and you. But secondly, just because you listen to your mom doesn't mean you are being restrained. But even if you are, take note, the main obligations of parents is to protect you. That's why they tell you not to do these things, not to go to the bar at super late in the night without anyone with you, not to go out the night like literally midnight, and then you're gonna get harmed. Who are you gonna blame? Your parents, right? So the point in which you actually go in their side and there's no filial piety and the parents have no obligation to keep protecting you, likely they're never gonna be incentivized to keep telling you these things. Literally on their side, what's likely to happen is you have parents that are more non-attached to you, meaning you have lesser mechanisms of protection that is able to protect these children on the comparative. But apart from that, what is my extension separate from LO? But before I move on, let's take a POI from closing. 3, 2, 1.
If their culture
that looks
says
like I'm doing good. What is my extension?
excuse me.
Because government says this, but the problem with that is that they never really were able to give or never able to look at the same way or never able to respect their wishes at the point in which they die on the comparative to their parents. Because in order for people to look back, they have to have an incentive to look back, to send help, to support. I mean, look at the Western status quo. When you're 18, you get shooed away from your home and you're now incentivized to live alone. And this is the narrative on their side due to the lack of filial piety in their status quo. What does this entail? At the point in which this decline support and perpetuated, taking care of their children becomes even more of a job as compared to a moral and principled obligation. And when they reach legal age, it's fine to shoo them away. Families become more segregated and separate because the norms in the Asian culture is for families to stick together, stay true and thick and thin. And you probably can't get that the same way in opposition. How does the opposition respond to this? They say, well, we'll still love them and respect them. It's just that filial piety will not exist. You can't have their cake and eat it too. The problem in their side is at the point in which you do this, take note of the info slide. Likely you're going to be more separated, so you're going to get more harm. Why does this win us in terms of meta on this debate? Firstly, in terms of the vulnerable actor meta, these vulnerable actors are likely to be children in this debate, and government already implicitly agreed to because they argued that children should have a choice and should not be harmed due to the generational problem. How did our counterfactual come in and respond to this? One, with the change in narrative and opening opposition, and this is where you fix these problems as compared to government, where you never fix it. Separation does not mean solvency. And even if these parents and children separated from each other due to the lack of filial piety, you don't fix anything. They're just more segregated and separate from each other. They're meaning the problems or the generational trauma will keep on existing. That's where the counterfactual came in. That's why we fixed the generational trauma. Two, this just becomes even more harmful due to the lack of incentive of parents to keep supporting their children in the future due to the lack of filial piety because they don't expect their children to actually give back to them, to keep supporting them in the future. There's just a bigger disconnect on their side. But lastly, the last push then is why even in our worst case, that Yesh's counterfactual did not exist. Like literally, she did not have a speech. And this is probably where closing government is gonna come in. And they're gonna try to say, well, there's still gonna be the worst cases where parents or children are going to be taken advantage of by their parents. But take note, right? Even if a majority of parents are going to employ the old version of teaching, we argue that this is the way the mechanism from Yesh is important. But also, we argue that we'll teach children to be firmer still with their principle while still respecting their parents. And this is why Yesh was so important in this debate. And due to the lack of engagement from government, closing government is also burdened to engage with this. That even at the point in which you never have the same level as what Yesh argued, you're still gonna have children that are able to stand firmer to their principles while still giving respect to their parents and the comparative as compared to opposition or on government where you just leave your home, where you just separate from them, where you just leave your parents and never give back and look back to them at the point in which they're old, you never are incentivized to help them at all. And this is the narrative that's going to be happening on their side and what we want to avoid. We want parents, we want families that are still more connected and are still able to support themselves. But what we want to do is change the old narratives or the old ways. And the only way you're going to do that is in opening opposition.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Just a reminder for speakers, if you're gonna ask for a POI, maybe wait for the closing teams or the opening teams to unmute themselves because maybe you might not hear their POIs. Okay. All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now opening the closing debate, calling on member. Hello, you're muted.
Sorry,
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Children in Chinese societies are taught that the way they treat their elders is a measure of their moral worth. We think that's very bad and abhorrent. That's why we need to move on from this. Few clarification that takes out opening entirely. Firstly, I think there's a need for us to actually clarify the debate so that we don't debate on fluff and actual flaw to debate on. Firstly, what does the debate look like? All this analysis comes prior to any opening analysis. One, there is no pressure for you, an obligation for you to remain filial. Like you can choose not to remain filial. That's what the decline looks as. So maybe because your parents are abusive, that's why you do not want to become you do not want to obey your parents. Maybe because you have more pressing issues that needs to be solved first, that you need to prioritize your career as an example instead of having to help your parents. This is not about people who wanted to do them. Even if you do that in the first place, you're still a good child. There's no problem in that. So secondly, we think that this trend already happens because this means that we're not defending a complete eradication of filial piety, but the declining trend is good enough. And if this trend is good enough, it's just why we support them. That's why CG would win in this debate. So what is the debate would happen on? This debate is whether you would support them or not. Opening is entirely out because there are so many other parts to culture. Because not just because when this is eradicated, that Asian being whitewashed is the biggest harm, is the biggest concern that you need to think of. What is the value of filial piety? It's the value that you think that you owe your parents everything. You are here because of your parents. You do not play any role in order for you to be in this position. That's why you owe your parents everything. We think this is very harmful, considering the efforts that you put into is your own and not entirely your parents. What is the counter prop then we think that OG never gives, and this alone already takes us above them? Firstly, we don't think that counter prop that OO assumed to us is detached parents. Whenever we prefer the prioritization of mutual respect. Reason why it is deprioritized with filial piety is not a decline is because there is a caste system that respect is already assumed. Just because you're a parent, that's why your children must respect you. You don't have to do anything. You can just do the bare minimum. You don't even have to be a good parent in order for your children to respect you. Now, parents would have to try more to gain admiration and love. You would have to survey upon them more. You would have to lead them by example. You have to show good values in order for you to gain all this respect. So why is this mutual respect matter then? Because the way that you get respect is different now. We agree that respect is something good, but the way that you get them is not by assumed. We think that it's in another way, which means that you are going to assume that your children is somewhat on equal standing as you. This means that you're okay to listen out to your kids and they're able to voice out to gain more autonomy to make their own choices. You will not limit their ability to pursue dream because they are also a person before they're your kid. Even if that means trading off obedience, we don't think that is much important. Now let's see some opening clash. Firstly, in all they say that this filial piety is culture. Therefore, that's why they are going to continue to be respectful and try to serve their parents. We think that this still can be solved by having mutual respect. Like this kid is also a human being and not just your kid. The culture is that you just exist to serve. We think that this must change at that point in time. Now, you're more likely to have a two-way conversation with your kid that they have to what are the advices that you give them and advise them on their decisions. That you cannot go out at bar because it's unsafe for you to do so. Instead of simply disregarding whatever that your kids say and more likely to have a form of tiger parenting because there is an assumed respect that goes on. The kids at the end of the day will have final say and we prefer that as much. Secondly, this alone answers both principle and pragmatic in OO because if family is so important in their world, we agree with that point. You will still have one on the our side of the house. However, only the dynamic change. in which you are still going to have your family, but you are going to listen to your kids more. This is not going to lead to whitewashing. And even if you wanted to argue whitewashing, not bad if it has benefits. You can move on from culture if it's only going to bring you any harm. The decline of whitewashing does not mean the eradication of culture. I think Asian culture is so rich, it's not the only thing that we have. We have clothing and food and not just parenting style. Even if there is something bad, as we will prove, why don't we just move on from them then? Firstly, the extension on family context, in which I don't think OG actually provides us any context on. But before that, are there any POIs from opening? 3, 2, 1. Now, for the family context, the concept of filial piety is very toxic. This is traumatizing for the children because this limits their autonomy to do whatever that they want. Because this concept justifies abusive parenting. You can just limit whatever that your kids do, and you say that I have autonomy and authority above you because I'm your parent. Children are more likely to resent their parents and get blamed for this in their relationship later on. This is why you can never get self-love or mechanization that OG never provided to us. Secondly, toxic expectation from the parents, because now this competition between parents and the other parents in raising the most little children, that these children is actually successful because you made them because you shape them into so, not because of their own actions, not because of their own efforts. Now you're more likely to subject their children to horrendous conditions such as tiger parenting and just calling out your children's names in order for you to motivate them to study or something like that. This entrenches toxic social rules within households and society, because note that this debate doesn't happen in a vacuum. Filial piety coexists with other societal norms like patriarchal structures. This means that filial piety only exacerbates the harm of those norms, because obedience is a key part of filial piety. Whatever your parents tell you is the law, regardless of what values of whether they are good or bad. You are required to be filial to those values which is practiced by your family. This means that on opposition, women are forced to be filial to their fathers in becoming one day. This would stifle tradition, because tradition would remain as it is. You're going to exacerbate traditional gender norms, which women would have to stay at home and boys would have to go out and work, and generational conflict with differing values, because now your children want to do something else and now your parents would want to tell you something else. There's only going to be more conflict in that matter. Your children are more likely to be pushed out under yours of the house. The nature of discussion that happens between the family members is also how we get more self-worth then. The nature of discussion that happens under your is more likely to be one-sided, with expectations and pressure that you need to study because you need to go to Oxford one day, to go to LSE. So instead of kindness and courtesy, you don't instead of the discussion happening in kindness and courtesy, you're not expected to discuss with them, just expected to have a one-way conversation. They just tell them whatever that they need to do. And this is already happening now, in which we see that there's more discussion on mental health by these parents with their children, and we see that mental health is being accepted more and more. I don't understand why that is very necessarily a harm then. The impact is very simple. One, there's no emotional repression because you're more likely to open up to your parents and say, what are your problems that you face right now? That's why you're more likely to achieve all those benefits that we enter. Secondly, there's less pressure and stress because your parents are not expecting you to be the solve all issues for them. You're going to have more autonomy to voice up and choose important life decisions. All these impacts is only available on the side OG and the side CG, and the opposition would only have to expect them and pressure them in order for them to become more successful. That is the status quo back then. We don't think that it is the situation now. What is the parents' reaction then with the decline of this filial piety, right? One, I think these parents, in terms of finance, we are not going to take these kids as a pension plan to take care of you when you get older. In fact, you're more likely to save up more in order for you to live better life when you stop working, when you retire. So you're more likely to push for better pension policies and things like that to ensure your future. We don't think that's a very much a contentious issue. Secondly, we think that these parents are more likely to teach your kids better because they're going to lead by example, try to win their respect as well. This is more likely to keep families together, to foster good relationships, which is also the metric pushed by Side OO. What have we proven to you? We have proven to you on how mutual respect is more likely to happen in the outside of the house, and that alone solve every issue that is happening in the side OO. We'll see what CO is going to bring. If there's only none, then I think side CG already wins the debate.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Again, I highly encourage everybody to take a POI. All right, calling on MO. You're here.
Okay, Chair, don't worry. I'll take a POI. I'll most definitely take a POI for engagement. POI is in chat. I'm just gonna put it here. Okay, but the other opening teams are from Mara anyway, so they should know to POI in chat. So please don't badger. Okay. The decline of filial piety transcends interactions even with the elderly. And the reason why this framing is debate winning, that is missing from opening opposition, is because not only would kids become selfish, but the imposition of themselves being the utmost importance in the entire universe will basically screw up how they interact with other people apart from just their parents, but also apart from just their ancestors. Because the impact that CO will discover today is how these kids will be taught as a child to how they interact with their parents will be worse when they grow up and when they interact with other individuals at the end of the day. I'm going to do the due diligence by completing opening opposition's characterization on what modern day filial piety looks like before I give my two extensions on firstly why it's likely going to screw up social interaction, and secondly why filial piety becomes it balances out hyper-individualism that exists in society today. What filial piety in modern day looks like. I think the framing for this characterization is important, that the parents that we have right now, although they still prioritize or practice filial piety because that was what they were growing up with, I think it's also shaped by previous filial piety failures as well, and they try to revamp as good as possible to make it susceptible to what the kids want nowadays. This looks like, firstly, respect is mutual. Sure, kids have to respect the elderly, but also it's important for parents to not just mitigate or not value any forms of opinions that the children have. So what it looks like is that parents also respect their children and what opinions that they have. Secondly, it looks like you owe your parents your entire life because your parents are doing reciprocally the same thing to your kids as well. This looks like probably providing the best form of education, the best form of resources in terms of growing up, or even just have the best form of environment as best as they can in a positive manner. Thirdly, it's also realizing the sacrifices that the elderly have been made in a positive way, in a way in which that maybe you talk about what are the sacrifices that your parents or their forefathers had to go through, in the ways in which that doesn't really expect the children to do the same thing, however, just appreciate what are the kind of sacrifices that they do to ensure that they have a good life at the end of the day. This completes all of the problems with familial piety being one that is just extremely toxic that both government teams just unfairly burden push to us. What the decline of filial piety is looking like is also missing from the opening half to a certain extent in closing half as well. The decline of filial piety looks like the narrative of didn't consent to being born in this world, the narrative that you don't owe anything to your parents, the self-impositioning of to be one that is central towards everything, to also say that all individuals are just dumb in general and we shouldn't value their opinions. The conclusion to this is that the likely narrative that government is going to have upon their children is hyper-individualism, and I'll prove to you why that is one that is bad. Let's just deal with the side of both governments first, right? But first and foremost, I want to make a good clarification that I think was missing out by all the teams in this debate. The first clarification is that the decline means that Generation Z, or maybe anyone who is in their 30s, are the ones who are practicing this form of decline of filial piety in the first place, right? What it means is that the same old individual who probably your abusers that what government is trying to defend on their side of the house still will prioritize the maybe some toxic version forms of filial piety that exist to this day. And the reason why this clarification is important, panel, is because the POI I gave to opening government also applies to closing government. That how you treat your parents is what's likely going to happen is your parents are going to double down on the abuses that they do on you. Because the power symmetry between the younger generations and old generations is still likely going to be big. That's the reason why doubling down on conservative parenting is likely going to happen on the side of government, and the retaliation that these children do because of the fact that they learn that filial piety is one that is bad is likely going to screw up their dynamics even worse at the point when they're still young children. The fundamental flop of both government teams is failing to explain where this debate takes place. CO will explain to you why it's bad when they're kids and why it's bad when they're grown-up adults. To just deal with opening government, familial dynamics is one that is not a big of a deal because we have stronger laws against abuses, for example, and parents are more aware of toxic filial piety values and tries to revamp them to make it one that is susceptible to individuals. But personal growth is much better on the side of opposition because parents become the support structures to help these children. So if it's true that children will most definitely make mistakes, at the very least, it's backed by the parents to support them at the end of the day. To just deal with CG, right, I think it's also one that is easy because the ways in which that CG fails in this debate is that not everything you do is about your parents because the dynamics that you have with your parents is a symbiotic relationship. Sure, your parents probably would have wanted you to become a doctor, but you being a doctor would have benefited you as well with the amount of money that you can earn to maybe invest in the hobbies that you want to do, or maybe start a perfect family, or even just do materialistic things like buy expensive things that gives you your own fulfillment, at the same time pleasing your parents as well. So it's a good relationship of the dynamic that you have with your parents at the end of the day. But the reason why autonomy cannot fly under the side of closing government is because you still live under your parents' house. So on scale, if you can successfully detach yourself from your parents, this is dealing with closing government's best case, by the way, you will suffer great loss because now you lost the one only support system that you have. And right now, when you ever do any forms of screw ups in your life, it's going to double down and haunt your life when you become adults because your parents wouldn't be there anymore. Before I move on, I'll take any POIs from opening. Okay, closing.
When you have mutual respect, all those benefits would still happen at our side as well. What do you mean that you would not follow your parents when you still respect them in a way?
Okay, you have to take a trade-off, right? Because obviously the motion says decline in filial piety, but you also have to explain, because a substantive amount of your speech is to talk about why filial piety is bad. That means you are preaching to kids to just not give a fuck about the elderly or just care about your parents. At the end of the day, you still have to defend the extreme version of declining filial piety to say why you wouldn't want to engage with these individuals at the end of the day. Extension then on completing opening opposition, and this deals with we're going to be the most dynamic team to deal with even the best case of government. That what happens when you successfully are able to just not care about any forms of opinion that your elderly do, right? The reason why it's bad is because it's likely going to screw up your social interaction. Two reasons why. Number one, immediate retaliatory response, because when you are taught to not just respect your parents, or at the very least when you're taught to not value their opinions, what it means is you're likely going to retaliate any opinions being brought by older generation. So what it means is that because of that, you're going to likely just do immediate backlashes at the point where you do interact with other people, at the point where you don't agree with them, which is just bad. Or secondly, on scale, conflicts get worse because government's benefit is short-term, because at the moment you get to say your own piece, in the long run, you're still going to have to interact with these individuals because they're your colleagues, because they're your friends. At the end of the day, it's going to screw up how your dynamics work with other individuals. But the reason why it balances out hyper-individualism is because of the fact that now you're given a choice between you just prioritize your own families or you just want to prioritize yourself. At the end of the day, under our side, because these two forms of narratives exist, individuals on the outside get to basically relive and just reprioritize what is important to them. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on the government whip. You're here.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, before I start my speech, reiterating that my POI preferences are in the chat. I'll take you by 5. If I don't, you can unmute yourself. Preferably from opening. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why a lot of the things in Ihsan's speech matter in this debate is because we understand that this debate has to surround filial piety being something that is already declining in status quo. This is not the paradigm that opposition wants to show to you, in which people start to revamp the way that they view filial piety, for example, or that suddenly filial piety becomes something that is less dominant or less coercive, for example, within status quo. We say that even if filial piety becomes less coercive on your side, we say that it's still something that is bad because it's likely to manifest in forms of toxic positivity, where you still expect your children to respect you, you still expect your children to give back to you at the end of the day, even if they weren't born for that very reason. We say that our alternative is so much better because we prefer a prevalence of a culture of mutual respect. The reason why they cannot get mutual respect on their side of the house, or the reason why they cannot co-opt this, for example, is because of the fact that it's not it's not actually mutual respect at the point where you have expectations over a child which you chose to bring into the world at the end of the day. So this illustrates the fact, the decline necessarily illustrates the fact that society is already progressing away from this archaic structure of obedience and the most likely cases abuse. Let's deal with opening clash then. OG tells you that they prefer self-care and that self-care is something that is important. We prove to you why exactly autonomy or controlled autonomy or calculated autonomy is better on our side of the house, at the point where no CO, we don't have complete autonomy, for example, where we suddenly just go out drinking and at the behest of our parents, and then we're just angsty teenagers, for example. But we tell you that the autonomy that we get looks like or manifest in the form of making your own decisions, for example, what course you want to take in university, for example, or what necessarily you do in terms of your study schedule, for example, which means that your parents aren't necessarily being helicopter parents at the end of the day, simply because of all the mechanisms that Ihsan explained to you, where like there's toxic competition between the parents, and this is something that is untouched by CO. The next thing I'll explain to you is how exactly OO's case is inexclusive coming from opening half. OO says that they want filial piety to be sustained because it's integral to Asian cultures. In the same breath, they say they want to change the form of filial piety within these cultures to be one where people suddenly have healthy relationships. If OO actually took my POI, it would, like, my POI literally says, if their culture says beating their children is fine, aren't you also forcing them to change their culture? What this means is that for them to accuse us of actually adopting Western values and for whitewashing Asians, it's quite funny because they want to whitewash their own values at the end of the day. Because Asian culture says that it's okay for you to actually hit your children in order to get them to be obedient to you, or it's justified for you to hit your children because they weren't obedient to you in at the end of the day. Because how else will they learn, right? Which means that a lot of the things that they say, like, oh, suddenly fostering healthy relationships, we're going to revamp Asian cultures, for example, will not work on their side of the house. So this change is likely to be also based on Western values where you don't punish your children when they misbehave. So if they want their model to actually pass in this debate, they have to defend having an accountability mechanism which teaches their children of consequences, which looks like the most likely case, which is hitting your children at the end of the day, or coercing your children not to do these things again in at the end of the day, which means that regardless what the values are of like an individual household, for example, filial piety doesn't mean that you have mutual respect at the point where anything your child does that goes against what you want will still be punished at the end of the day. So next, considering like the crux of filial piety is obedience to elders. The next thing is that we prove why we have healthy relationships without filial piety, and this is also dealing with CO. They never prove why obedience is exclusive to them, and this is referring to like both, like the entire op bench. We prove that we trade off obedience because we want to foster a healthy relationship. And note that obedience in this sense doesn't mean that, oh, we don't want our children to listen to us, for example, but we said that the children will necessarily look up to the parents at the point where there is mutual respect, which means that the parents then lead by example. The reason why children will still listen to their parents are for a few reasons. Firstly, parents parents are the first people that they see. Literally, they came out of their mother, right? Which means that the parents are likely to raise them in the first place, which means that this is the only authority that they know from birth, which means that you don't necessarily need to coerce them into listening to you. They will already listen to you because literally they were born from you, they live with you, which means that they're likely to follow whatever you do, right? Because children are impressionable. They respect what their parents ask them to do because they understand that it is something good, especially when it's devoid of abuse and strict enforcement. And this deals with OO's claim that the decline is bad because now children are suddenly less incentivized to be obedient to their parents. Before I move on, POIs. Opening. 3, 2, 1. Whoops, no POI from opening. Closing.
Yeah, like obedience is not just expected within families, but also in corporate spaces, in schools, in any way, shape, or possible. So to a certain degree, it is instrumental to social climate, which is just good for individuals.
Okay, the reason why people will still respect each other in the common space is exactly what our alternative looks like, right? At the point where the parents actually prefer or actually enforce the prioritization of mutual respect, for example, children will learn a few things. Firstly, they'll learn how to create their own boundaries, for example, which means that they know what is respect and what isn't respect. So for example, if someone screams at you on the road, for example, or someone hits you out of anger, for example, they're not going to relate that to, oh, this is like what my parents did to me, which means that it's okay because they just want me to be better, which means that children on our side are less susceptible to abuse on the in the outside world or in working conditions. So for example, if they are subjected to horrible working conditions, they recognize what is abuse, for example, and therefore they understand what boundaries they should set, for example, or they know how to actually get out of those situations. The next thing on why exactly we create better protection for children at the end of the day is because what Ihsan explains to you is very important, where children are more likely to go to their parents in times of trouble because they don't necessarily fear their parents at the end of the day. The reason why fear is so prevalent on their side of the house is even devoid of abuse, you're still going to have some sort of expectation that people expect upon you, and you always have that pressure to necessarily fulfill that expectation at the end of the day. So even in the best case where your parents expect you to be a doctor, for example, and you don't want to be a doctor, and these are all the things that I'm mechanizing from OJ as well, it's going to be bad for you if you do become a doctor because you don't have fulfillment at the end of the day, at the point where you're an adult. And the reason why you'll never break out of this cycle is because filial piety doesn't die off the moment you turn 21, for example. Filial piety lasts for a lifetime, even if your parents pass away, because at the info slide literally says your ancestors, right? So at the point where you want to stop becoming a doctor even after your parents die, it's not going to fly, because you have filial piety to even the dead on their side of the house. The reason why we break generational trauma is because now people children can still be respectful without being without having filial piety at the end of the day, which means that people are more likely to build their relationships on the foundation of communication on our side of the house. For all those reasons, propose.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now calling on the last speaker, opposition whip. You're here.
All right, just give me a second to... Is my voice echoey?
Yes, it's echoing, but I can understand your speech.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, never mind then. Have your eyes in chat, please. Sorry, my speech in 3, 2, go. Is it very echoey? Because my partner's texting me that my voice.
Yeah, it is.
Is it much better to speak like this?
Maybe just come closer to the mic so that you're audible to the whole room.
Is this better? I'm so sorry. This is the best that I can do.
Yeah, I can still clearly understand.
Okay. Guys in chat, okay? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Few rules of housekeeping that I'm going to do in my speech. The first here is to just deconstruct the case coming from government. Because what they tell you is that the alternative that they prefer is a world of mutual respect. I don't think this is an exclusive case, specifically because respect can be derived from other things as well. But what we preach exclusively in the world of opposition is a greater degree of respect towards your elderly, towards your parents. And this is the narrative that we still want to retain towards the end of this debate. Second layer here. It's just a question whether it's true that individuals or parents are likely to opt into a Montessori parenting style where mutual respect is going to form healthier dialogues within a family or unit. We think this is untrue because number one, note how these this specific parenting style is not going to be accessible for a lot of individuals. We think what's more likely is that decline means that parents are more likely to be detached from their kids. They're not going to be as invested into their children's lifestyles. They want their children to understand that the moment you turn 20, you are an independent adult, that the consequences that you hold to your life is entirely yours. And this is the exact harm that we've been pushing to you since our extension speech. How did our extension come to play then? I think number one, we proposed to you as to why the narrative of filial piety is likely to become corrective in the very first place. Note that there is a difference here from what closing government implies, right? Because if they can assume that the decline of filial piety comes from this debate as well, I think it's also fair for us to say that the filial piety is also likely to become good, because there are reasons like information just being far more democratized. Parents are just being more aware of the different parenting styles to suit the needs of their children. We think that's something that's still charitable and still within this debate. But number two, right? Note how the non-exclusivity of the case coming from government, because if they want to preach mutual respect, we think that still happens in the world of opposition, if not greater, right? Because individuals like parents on our side of the house invest greatly within their children, which is something that they've conveniently missed out within their engagement then. Our extension uniquely deals with the best case coming from government. In instances where adults still have to express their individuality, they're making an irreversible form of freedom that is their exclusive support system. What Adam was telling to you is that familial units and the practice of filial piety is something that's exclusive and needs to be paramount within debates. Because number one, this is an exclusive support system. It is bred from environments over a lifetime of familiarity that comes from parents and children. When individuals like these are far more forgiving of you and are more more like invested in your personal growth. The comparative in Gov is if you don't have like familial structures to depend on because they want to defend independence as a whole, that means you have to opt for external support structures that are less forgiving of you because they don't know anything about you. They have to find other like paradigms of relation, for instance, to be more understanding of your character and being forgiving of you. We think on a comparative here, the exclusive support system that comes from families and filial piety makes parents more forgiving and like more invested within your like cycle of growth or like the curve of your personal growth, for instance. But note how we can still co-opt external support, right? Because you still have friends, for instance, or like club societies, individuals you can relate with. But familial support is exclusive here because the fact that we place an importance towards filial piety means that individuals want to continuously invest in their relations with their families, for instance. And this is why it is exclusive. That's why it's exclusive for us to have the incentive of having conversations and to navigate better decision makings because of the fact that we're able to retain the like presence of parents being relatively close to their children on the very get-go for the concept of filial piety. But secondly, note the comparative, right? We think what Adam specifically like pushed out in his extension was to say that filial piety is indeed a reciprocal relationship. It's not that parents will push like the most toxic forms of narratives to individuals. We think that's unfair. We think the concept of filial piety and the best of it tells you to put in more for your children, to send them to the best schools to increase their job employability, to tell your children to choose conventional jobs because it breeds stability. But this form of acceptance literally just means that filial piety tells you to push your children to do more, right? But they want to tell us that this is something that's still bad because that's how you allow like pervasive narratives of toxicity, for instance. We think that's far better because that's the only way you can reclaim accountability. How are you going to reclaim accountability from your parents if you're distant from them in the very first place? We think regardless on both sides of the house, if you still want like a parent, at the very least you want parents that are invested in your lives rather than parents that from the get-go already tell you to breed or embrace individuality. So this is contrary to the Gov's narrative of independence. But on the third layer, right, if you embrace the kind of narrative that the entire government bench defends here, you are like less forgiving of like your children wanting to stay with you in your 20s, for instance, because you have to embrace the Western idea of independence at the very least, right? What we prove here is that when there is an accountability mechanism, there is a higher standard in parenting because accountability towards your children is present. That you have to ensure that your children are like in like different classes, enrolled in different classes, or the best of schools, for instance, because filial piety also assigns a great responsibility for parents to ensure that the lives of their children are taken care of. Oh, but before six, sure, closing.
How do you enforce filial piety on your side?
So filial piety is enforced like culturally, obviously, as what Adam puts it out. But we've already pushed out to you that the enforcement of filial piety also comes like in better ways. We don't think it's true that individuals are going to be beaten up now. That's why society is more punitive when they see like TikTok videos of parents punishing those kids, right? We think it's not true that the idea of filial piety is as abusive as it used to be now. So even in the worst case, that's why we can still have accountability mechanisms and we're likely to have those conversations. Parents on the last layer don't want you to abandon those children. That's why they're likely to listen to you. So the propensity of mending familiar relationships is far more superior on our side of the house. But also note on like the last piece of our extension here is to note that what we're doing here is to bridge the generational gap that is prevalent within individuals within society. Because we don't tell individuals to like trade off completely their culture, we focus on like the corrective mechanisms that are likely to happen towards the world of filial piety, right? I think this is a like far more charitable approach to this debate rather than just to compare the worst of filial piety, but to reclaim like the best parts of independence at the end of the day. So conclusively, what have we told you today? Number one, I think we've told you that the idea of filial piety is something that's good for as long as there are existing corrective mechanisms to ensure that it doesn't become exorbitant as Gov puts it out to be. We would like to defend this narrative. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
All right, great job. Thank you so much for all the debaters who may now across the house. Yeah. Wait, let me check if there are rooms in Discord. Lam, maybe you can just head there so that the debaters can just stay in the room. Yeah.
So which one are we going?
Wait, I'm checking right now. You can just go to. Okay, there. Maybe you can just do room 5, deliberation. Okay. Yeah. In Discord. Okay. All right. I can see you there. I'll head there right now.
Hi, Cross. Thanks for the